Welcome back to a special edition of the Boxscore Geeks show. I'm your host, Ray Alvarez, and we have a special guest who is very special. I just want to keep reusing the word special as many times as I can. Professor David Berri. Dave, say
Hey.
hey. All right, well, that's very auspicious. All right, as always, our show is produced by our own voice of God, our producer, Brian Foster. You can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Say hey, Brian.
Oh, hey, I'm glad to have two shows, a special weekend show with a special guest. So, yeah, this is a great topic, and I learned a lot from the last show, so I'm glad we're going to get into it again and educate people like me.
All right. So, by the way, I realized I didn't say your Twitter handle. It's at Wages of Wins on Twitter. So, to keep you all in the loop, I wrote an article last week where I talked about the issue between descriptive and predictive stats, focusing on an article that popped up over at Nylon Calculus. This was actually enough back and forth, and my bobblehead just went down. Oh, I think I broke it. Anyway.
Oh, no.
Uh, anyway, this was enough to actually get Dave Berri to chime in because, Dave, you've been around forever in terms of the analytics movement. And Nylon Calculus, which has a lot of people that have done the APBR, is it ABPR? I always forget what it stands for. That kind of movement in its stats, and it's a lot of the same old that you've seen. So this was enough to get you to say, hey, you'd come on the show to discuss it, in particular because one of the problems we had with the article was just a random footnote that bashed wins produced for not being predictive, which is a problem that's been around forever. Dave, you said you were fine just going over this article, and I would love to hear your thoughts. And for those of you that don't know, Dave Berri, very odd if you're at the Boxscore Geek Show and don't know Dave Berri. Dave Berri, lead author of Wages of Wins, Stumbling on Wins, has authored or co-authored more than 50 sports economics articles. Is that correct, Dave? Published in academic journals?
About 60 now.
60, geez, okay, I'm gonna have to update. I think I've been saying 40 forever, and I knew you were near 50, so close to 60.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's Dave's pedigree. Obviously, if you're at this site, you should know him, but just in case, there's your ramp up. Dave, you want to add anything else to your resume for the listeners?
No, I'm working on a textbook now that's going to be coming out in about a year and a half or so. So some of this that we're talking about is actually this will be thought of as standard textbook stuff, which is not something that the ABER community seems to know a lot about.
So let's talk that. You actually you went even more granular than I did, because all I did is I looked at three problems with this article. I said, why are you using wins produced or win shares on their own to be predictive and thinking that's a good test? Why are you trying to use other stats to explain RAPM, which is what they're trying to do with Dredge, which uses play-by-play statistics? I think that was the two. And then, I think I said that. And then, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Actually, I think it was only two things, Dave. It was, why are you using these descriptive stats to be predictive? And why are you trying to explain the secondary stat? And you went even more granular to some of the issues with the words they were saying, which is a little rough because, full disclosure, I don't normally like getting into behind the scenes stuff. The author of the paper actually did comment, or the Nylon Calculus speech actually did comment a few times on the Boxscore Geeks site. And I deleted both those comments. We've had our back and forths about comment section listeners. You know what it is at this point. And my basic point was, first, I don't like entitled people. So it kind of came in with a attitude of entitlement. And then I don't like basically factually untrue stuff. So when you're talking textbook stuff, Dave, we're going to talk about just some of the basic fundamental issues with this paper or article. I don't even want to call it a paper, with this blog post. Let's get started.
Yeah, I mean, what he's doing here is he's trying to present a statistical model to measure something. And so if you start off in the article, he has a methodology statement. And so the first sentence of the methodology statement is the model setup. This is what he says. The model setup is pretty basic. I'm trying to predict 15-year RAPM with a bevy of stats. Okay, so he starts off with that. So his dependent variable is RAPM, and he's using a bunch of stats to predict that. So the objective in doing analysis of productivity of athletes in a team setting is you're trying to connect what the player does to the outcome of the game, which is wins. So your
Or
dependent
and
variable.
for what it's worth, if people aren't aware of this, this is in your wins produced, how to calculate wins produced write up, which
Yes.
I'll include in the show notes. You connect it. The first start is point margin, how much my team outscores the opponent team by, I believe, adjusted for either possession or whatever. That's the start, and then it turns out that point margin connects very well to wins.
Yes. So, but you're trying to explain an outcome. So he has a model here, RAPM, which is an adjusted plus minus variation. If you go back to the original adjusted plus minus, which was Wayne Winston and then Dan Rosenbaum, and you read what they were doing, those initial models, if you look at what they explain, and this is really important when you talk about a statistical model. First and foremost, when you evaluate a statistical model, you have to ask the question, what are you explaining what you purport to explain? That's the first step. You're not trying to predict out a sample first. That's not where you're starting. You start with, I have a sample. Can I explain what's going on in my sample? And if you go back to the original adjusted plus minus stuff and you look at their actual explanatory power, the answer is they can explain less than 5% of what's going on. And Arturo Gaetti wrote about this, and that's very clear. So the first thing that should be in this article is we should ask the question, if RAPM is your model that you're looking at, what is the explanatory power of that model? Tell me that first. Does that model explain wins the way you set it up? Does it? And I think the answer is it really doesn't. And they should tell you that.
And for what it's worth, by the way, and I have to hop in, Dave, because I actually just pulled up the initial RAPM paper, and this is what bugged me. It's in that paper they said adjusted plus minus APM does not explain production, wins, whatever, very well. They said we've come up with a brand new model, RAPM, that does it better. And they said, and I'm looking at this at the very end, and I think their explanatory power, as purported in the Sloan paper by Joe Sill, is about 15 to 16%.
Yes.
So they say
does not actually explain much of anything, and that really should be said. They should, and what they do to get the model to explain is then they add back in the error term.
And so what does the error term mean in terms of regression?
Okay, all right. So in your model, there is the part that you explain. So you're trying to explain something. Let me just take a different. So I'm right now working on a paper looking at salaries in Italian soccer. Okay, so we have a model where the dependent variable is what the soccer players are being paid. I'm trying to explain that. Okay, and I have a collection of independent variables that I think explain that. Shot attempts, shooting efficiency, tackles, whatever the players are doing on the field. And plus other explanatory factors like their age and things of that nature. So we have this collection of variables that explain what they're being paid. Okay, so that's how a model is set up. The error term is the portion of the dependent variable, in this case it would be salaries, that I do not explain, that my model does not explain. What the adjusted plus minus people have done in the past, and they do this, is they take the error term and they add it back in. Every model, no matter how you construct it, if you take what you explain and what you don't explain together, that is 100% of the dependent variable. Your model explains what your model explains, what your model does not explain is 100%. Does that make sense?
No. Well, and also it's worth noting.
Wait. I want to make sure that part made sense. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So
what you're saying happens makes sense, but it doesn't make sense logically because you're saying a model is supposed to. We know a model is not reality, so a model is supposed to be trying to the correct word,
something, and it's not
model
100%.
reality.
So let's say your model explains 70% of what's going on. All right, that means your model did not explain 30%. Okay, in the case of regularized adjusted plus minus, which you just said, the model explained 15, 16%, which means it did not explain 84%. If you add back in the 84% back in, you're right. You now explain 100%. But you didn't actually explain 100%. Your error term was 84. You did not explain the vast majority of what you were trying to explain. So you are cheating. That is wrong to do that. You cannot do that. You cannot add the error term back in. That is wrong. And you cannot say somebody else did it in the past, therefore I get to do it. No, they were wrong and you are wrong. There is no way you get to do that. So if your model is using the error term to explain something, you are wrong. You are not allowed. So that's the first
And this
step.
is, and just so we're clear, this is in basic regression analysis because I find,
This is very standard. We explain this in the first week of lecture, what an error term is and how you interpret it.
and by the
Yeah.
way, I want to go off on a slight mini rant here because one of the things that has turned me off to the advanced stats movement, Brian's heard me rant about this a bunch on the show, so Brian, to hear more of this. But Patrick, myself, Arturo had gone to Sloan a few years ago, and it would be a weird signaling thing where I'd talk to somebody and they'd say, I know wages of wins and whatever, and I just don't really like the metric or I don't really like Dave Berry's work. And I'd go, what you are telling me is that I shouldn't respect you, not the other way around. Not that I shouldn't respect Dave Berry, that I shouldn't respect you ever talk to me, because you're talking regression analysis and you've taught this for years. You're a tenured professor that teaches this. You're highly published. If someone wants to bash you, I'm more than fine with this, Dave. If someone wants to say Dave Berry is an egghead who uses regression models and box score statistics to explain wins, and that's not what you should use in sports, I may not agree with that, but fine, that's an argument. When someone says Dave Berry's analysis is not very good, I trust this other guy, I go, Dave Berry is, and I hope you're fine hearing this term, Dave, an expert in this. This other person is not. If you trust the other person over Dave Berry, you are doing something wrong, especially when, as you're saying, you're not even getting into complex sports stuff. You are talking textbook level mistakes.
I'm talking first week of regression analysis level mistakes. This is the
Yes.
very this would be at the very beginning. Then I want to go on to the next sentence here. Okay. This is the next sentence in this guy's thing. He says the 15-year RAPM model is used as a dependent variable because it's not directly influenced by the very independent variables I'm using to predict it. Okay, that sentence makes zero sense from a regression standpoint. Going back to my salary example, why am I using on-field metrics to explain an Italian player's salary or compensation? Because I think those things are directly related to what they're going to be paid. That's the whole point of a model. The point of the model is you go find independent variables that you think explain the outcome. If your independent variables do not explain the outcome, why are you including them in the model? That doesn't make any sense. It suggests to me you don't know what an independent variable is, and you don't know what a dependent variable is. And if you don't know what that is, you don't even know what the basics are. You don't even know where you are at the beginning here. Okay, so this person does not understand the basic structure of a model. And then they go on to say that I'm using a large enough sample to deal with the issues of noise and collinearity. Okay, all right. This is another thing about regression analysis. There's an issue with multicollinearity. And what that simply means is if your independent variables are highly correlated with each other, it is impossible for the model to figure out how each of those independent variables independently affects the dependent variable. And the way it manifests itself is the standard errors and the coefficients are going to be a lot larger, and your coefficients are going to be insignificant. Okay? Now, the way that the abermetric people have tried to get around this is they've increased their sample size. If you know how standard errors are calculated, you know that as the correlation of the independent variables goes up, the standard errors go down. However, as your observations go up, your standard errors, as your correlation goes up, your standard error goes up. As the observations go up, your standard errors come down. All they're doing is masking the problem. They're not eliminating the problem. They're just masking it. Okay, larger samples don't make collinearity go away. They just make it so it's not obvious anymore. That didn't solve your problem. You still have collinearity problems.
And by the way, I want to hop in with a really interesting point on the RAPM stuff. So we've already discussed just when we're discussing we discussed at the very beginning, basically some of the issues with the adjusted plus minus statistics that this new model is trying to explain. So that was adding the error back in, et cetera. But then even to your point there, what's fascinating about using 15-year RAPM is there's other research by some fun people, not anything complicated. This is why I like it. It's much simpler. A guy named Vilku over at Exploring NBA did this, I believe, where the average NBA career is 6 seasons in the modern NBA, around 6 seasons. It goes up and down, sometimes as low as 5, sometimes as high as 7, but around 6 seasons. And additionally, I pointed out when I did that, I did an article where I bashed some of the Sloan papers that did the same thing this one is saying, where first off, they're saying we have a larger sample and they're saying we're throwing out samples below, I believe they say 3,000 possessions. Well, I noted in some of the Sloan papers, they were throwing out, important people that, yeah, maybe they're below that threshold, but it's still a lot. So what you're saying is they're using this big 15-year sample, which already is kind of questionable because the average NBA careers doesn't last that long or anywhere close to that long. And then they're saying they throw out on the other side, they're saying they're throwing out players like Kevin Garnett, who, yeah, he didn't play starters minutes, but he still played a significant amount of minutes. So it's kind of interesting because they're kind of, you used a very good term that I liked where you said they are masking the problem. And it sounds like they're masking it in both ways. They're making their sample big to make the collinearity go away. And then they're throwing out smaller samples to try and make it look like their data set is cleaner when they're throwing out what we would argue are important players.
Yeah, and the other thing about the way they're doing this is, let us say that adjusted plus minus, despite the fact that it doesn't explain very much and that you've added the error term in, let us say that it actually was right and that that's actually a good measure of performance. The reason why they argue it's a good measure of performance is because, unlike the box score statistics, adjusted plus minus is supposed to measure a player's defense. That's supposed to be in there. But if you look at the person's independent variables that they chose, none of them are defense because there are no box score measures of defense.
Well,
right?
I disagree with that. There's no box score measures of team defense currently. There is some new stuff like the sports view data. It's entirely
any of the new stuff?
They're not using. Okay, so you're right. I wanted to just make
I mean,
sure
if I look at their independent variables, none of these are actually defensive variables, right? They're not using any measure of player defense. There's no on the ball defense in this list.
Let's see. They've got the steals. They've got offensive fouls drawn, blocks. But yeah, to your point, they are not using any out of the box score defensive statistics that people normally complain about.
Problem. If your dependent variable you claim includes on the ball defense is part of the story, and your collection of independent variables does not include that variable, your model is by your very own definition misspecified. And because it's misspecified, your coefficients are biased, and therefore you do not know exactly what the hell you're measuring. When you misspecify a model, the coefficients you get are not going to be precise, unless you can claim that the variable that you left out is completely uncorrelated with what's in. And I don't think you can claim that. And so therefore, that doesn't work either. So the way they structure the model here, it's misspecified. I don't think the collinearity problem is solved in any way whatsoever. What they're trying to explain doesn't actually explain wins. And so this is just not a very good model. And the other thing is, and this is the bigger issue, he keeps saying over and over again, predict.
And that's for the thing that he's proud of, what he was clearly trying to do. And I hate to point this out, Dave. I'll make sure you get full credit. A lot of the stuff you're saying is actually stuff that I've got in the works for an article about another statistic called BPM. And if you go down, you'll notice he has this reduced mean squared error weighted by new players, 1998 to 2001, where he's trying to say dredge is the best metric, and it's exactly what you're saying, because it is better at predicting upcoming wins than BPM. That's clear. Yes. That was clearly his end goal. He wanted to say, I have a stat that's better than BPM. And the reason they're using BPM as the gold standard is what you're saying, predictability. So let's get into the issues with that.
Okay, so.
Oh, and sorry, to finish up my thought, I realized I opened. I'm writing an article that's going to be saying a lot of what you just said out loud. If anybody was watching the video, I was like smiling. And it's because a lot of these are like basically bullet points that I've already got planned out in an upcoming article on BPM.
So here's the issue with having your goal be to only predict. Okay, when you're doing analysis of what an athlete is doing, let's say I'm doing an analysis, we're looking at this in terms of baseball or football or any other sport, and other sports do the same kind of analysis. The objective of the analysis is really straightforward. What you're trying to do is you're trying to explain, how did the players on the field right now impact the outcome of the game I am seeing right now? How did that rebound? How did that shot made or shot missed or turnover? How does that affect the game?
And for other sports, baseball started this. How did that double play in the second inning?
Yes.
How did that home run in the fourth? What did that do? And by the way, we have these now where they have these very cool win probability charts that do just that. After a box score action happens, here's what that did to the team's chances of winning.
Exactly. So that's the objective. Okay, these guys are throwing that objective out the window, and they're saying, no, no, no. What my objective is to predict the future. I'm not going to tell you how that rebound affected the outcome of the game you're looking at. I'm telling you how it's going to affect the outcomes you're going to see next year. Why the hell would that be my objective? Why would I want to do that? First and foremost, I want to explain what I'm trying to explain. Now, where does out of sample forecasting come in? Okay, this is where you would think about this. And people who do statistical analysis will emphasize this. They'll say, you've got to do some kind of out of sample test because you don't want to have it be that your model simply applies to the sample that you looked at. You want to know whether it applies to other samples as well.
And
And
in
so,
computer science, a common term that would show up for this for like machine learning was you don't want to overfit the data to the training set.
so exactly. So you want to say that I'm not just explaining what I'm trying to explain. I'm also able to say something about some other samples. That's fine. But nobody would say that you never try to explain what you're trying to explain. You don't just do out of sample forecasting. You have to first explain what you're trying to explain. Nowhere in this article does he tell you, can he explain what he's trying to explain? And the answer is he can't. He can't do it unless he adds the error term back in. And that's why this model doesn't work. Yeah, don't tell me how when I add the error term back in, my model predicts.
Well, let's be fair. I do want to be careful about analysts we bash, and we might bring up another one that started a lot of the work that this is following. But to your point, if he's trying to explain RAPM, and let's say he doesn't add the error term back in because it doesn't appear he does, the very easy issues you can point out is what I said in my article. It doesn't make any sense that he is being proud of his model because it predicts wins next year. You're trying to explain, the model purports to wanting to explain current RAPM. And then additionally, you're saying, even if that was the case, even if his model does that perfectly, doesn't add the error term back in, which again, I want to be clear, I don't believe he does. However,
but APM does add the error term back in though, right? The original model adds the error term back in.
Yeah,
right?
but I'm saying let's be, because by the way, here's another game I've seen in these variants, right? So we talk about APM that we've bashed, and our APM is based on that, and there are other ones. And then people say, well, this variant, this flavor, because this flavor doesn't have that problem. So for instance, ESPN has their own version of RAPM called RPM now, and they don't tell anybody how they calculate it. So I want to be careful just because it's a very neat trick to say this variant of the metric doesn't have the problem you're saying. And I go, well, how did you calculate it? And they go, oh, that's somewhere else. So I want to be careful and not, even if we know that's been an issue, I don't want to throw it on this author. But I will say, you've already said, the model's misspecified and it doesn't make any sense to do prediction. Especially, I think this is important to prediction with what I said in my article, and I'd assume you'd follow up on, or hope you follow up on, is even if you're trying to predict next year, same exact problem you had with the original metric. Nowhere in here is included anything that we know impacts the future. So you can't even get credit for being a better predictor because none of the things, not none of, many of the things.
That's the point you brought up in your article. So I want to predict next season's performance. And the only thing this guy has in his article are box score statistics.
Or play-by-play statistics from this year.
Yeah, right. But we all know that player performance is not simply a function of their stats. Players' age, they switch teams, there's coaching, there's other things that affect performance. We know that. You didn't include any of those things. So it's a little ridiculous to say, I'm trying to explain the future, but I'm not including the things that I know explain the future.
Exactly.
So that's the problem. Then we go on to where he reports the coefficients. Okay, and this should be okay. I had this conversation with an Abermetrics person many years ago. They put up some analysis online, and they did exactly what this guy does. They have the coefficients presented, and it's from a regression of some sort. They don't report the standard errors. You can't report regression coefficients if you don't also tell us what the standard error is, because the standard error is used to tell us whether or not it's significant or not. Are your coefficients different from zero? That's why we need to know the standard error. He doesn't tell us the standard errors. I will say this other Abermetric person that I spoke to years ago, and I said, you didn't tell me the standard errors. He actually asked the question, is that important? Again, this is stuff you cover in the first month of regression analysis. You got to tell people what the standard errors are. You got to tell people what your estimates are. We have to have some way of evaluating your estimates. You're supposed to know this. If you don't know this stuff, then you really don't know how to do this kind of analysis. Okay,
And just to
and
be clear, in the wages of wins write-up, you include the T statistic.
the t
And that's
statistic is the coefficient divided by the standard error. That's
okay.
how the t statistic is calculated. So the t
So just to be clear, because I realized when you said standard error, the first thing I did was just look at the wins produced write-up to make sure, and that I wanted to avoid a question that would come up in the comments, which might be, Dave says it's really important to report the standard error. I only see T statistic. You just said that. Okay.
yeah, that's what. Yeah, and by the way, if you ask that question, you're supposed to know what t statistic. So, all right, so it doesn't tell us what these things are. So we have no idea when we look at this model. We do not know the explanatory power of the model. We don't know the standard errors. We don't know which of these variables are significant. Okay, um, we're just supposed to take it that this is supposed to be the best model possible. So this model is hopelessly flawed. It's written badly in the sense that this person does not understand how basic regression analysis works. And you can come back and say, I really do know. I took a class on it. Well, you didn't pay attention very well because this is all wrong.
Well, that's one of the issues, just kind of off textbook learning, Dave, but just on to kind of my issue with advanced stats that, as I mentioned, Brian gets to hear me rant about every week, is I've noticed in a lot of statistical analysis that's occurred in basketball, when you criticize someone else's work, they get very defensive as if you were attacking them personally. And then one of the issues I've had with a lot of the criticism that Wins Produce, Wages of Wins, Boxscore, Geeks have received is I have no problem with the criticism. I have a problem with the criticism when you don't apply the same level of criticism to other statistics. For instance, if people were as concerned with the issues they purport to be concerned with wins produced in PER, in BPM, in RAPM, none of these other metrics would ever have gotten off the ground, but clearly they're not. And then additionally, if you're going to say this person is being rude to me because they don't like my stat, you kind of prevent any discussion from happening. So this is what actually has happened with this one, where I made I guess an insult of this metric, which by the way was nowhere near as in depth as yours. I was actually saving a lot of that for my article on BPM, and then the end result was the person said, "Well, you're being rude to me."
Yeah, see, what I'm doing here is I'm walking through this article exactly as I would walk through an article being presented at a meeting. This is exactly the kind of comments that if you actually wrote this as an academic, you would be seeing. If this were an academic article, this would be really a painful experience for him to go through because it wouldn't just be me saying these things. It would be everybody in the audience saying exactly the same things. We would be seriously questioning, do you know anything? You're supposed to know how these things work. If you're going to do this kind of analysis, you have to know the very basics. And it's really clear when you read through this, he doesn't understand the very basics of doing analysis. He doesn't understand the importance of standard errors. He doesn't understand that you're trying to explain something. He doesn't understand what an independent variable is. And again, the basic dependent variable RAPM, again, as far as we know, is constructed on a model that allows them to add the error term back in. He's not using RAPM as that model was estimated. He's using it with something else thrown in. There is no such thing as a team adjustment, which is an error term. You don't get to do that. And
Yeah,
so this is this is, and it should be the case that if the avermetrics community consisted of people who understood basic regression analysis, everyone should be saying the same damn things about this. I'm not saying anything that's not in a standard textbook. This is all just textbook stuff.
well, that's one of my favorite anecdotes from our time at the Wages of Wins together, where you had an article and someone hopped into. I don't want to. I'll avoid naming too many names if it's not in articles we're going over in this show, Dave. But someone hopped into the comment section and said, "You're wrong, Dave. This is standard in freshman level econ classes. I forget if it was regression
Yeah,
analysis, econometrics, whatever. But they said something to the notion of this is standard in every intro level textbook for all these classes. Well, you taught that intro level class. And of course, many people in the field. So you said, I don't teach that in my class. You went and asked a bunch of other people. And let's be clear, you've published with some big names. You've chaired some committees with some big names. So I'm not saying you went to like rinky-dink schools. You asked real people and none of them did it. So we have people that hop in and say, no, this is how you teach it. And when you actually talk to the people teaching it, they go, I don't know what they're talking about.
exactly. And I remember that incident, and I remember talking to people, and they were like, "We have no idea what this person's talking about. That is not the way we do this." And I said, "It's not that I'm saying what you're suggesting is wrong. The argument they had is I was measuring the size of a coefficient by talking about a concept that we use in economics called elasticity. And elasticity is something is looking at the responsiveness of one variable to another. It is something that we teach in principles of micro and a bunch of other economic classes. It's very standard, very basic. Everyone does this. And this person came in and said, no, no, no. Basic regression says you do it this way. I'm like, I'm sorry. What I'm doing is perfectly valid. Everybody does this. There's nothing wrong with what I'm saying here. And this person was insisting that they knew this. I did ask that person directly, have you ever taught basic regression? And his answer was no. So, okay, you've never actually done this, so I don't think you know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And yeah, obviously I don't want to go too much further down the rabbit hole because we're talking, article comments and articles from past, and then, everybody listening is like, I don't know what you're talking about. But that answers this article, which I was fine with. And I mean, it's an interesting one for me where you said a lot. You said the word textbook, and I think I parroted it back at you a bunch. This is intro level, textbook level, first week level. And that's a lot of the problems I have with these things, because with a lot of the arguments I've gotten into, and the descriptive versus predictive is an example, and even the comment section following the article followed that, where people said, well, isn't something that's descriptive inherently predictive? And I had to go, no, there's no way of knowing that, football's a fantastic example, I'd imagine, where so much changes year to year that what a player did last year can't really, I think you've shown this very simply in
Yes.
Stumbling on Wins. What a player did last year, and this is good news for me as an Aaron Rodgers fan because he had a very bad season last year. What a player did last year has almost no bearing on what they did next year because so much stuff changes. There's so many injuries. The lifespan of an NFL player is 3 years. Players' primes are even shorter than they are in other sports. That, just because I have a metric that explains exactly what won the game in football, and I believe Brian Burke, who's not ESPN, he has his win probabilities that he does, that has little to no bearing on next season.
Yes, and also if you're going to do prediction, and that's what you want to focus on, um, if you're going to use the wins produced model, if you're going to try and forecast next season with this, you have to take the model apart and put it back together again, because the model is based on who the teammates were of the player the previous season. So if I take LeBron James away and I put him on another team, I have to take, for all those players that are now playing with LeBron James, they're going to play differently because he's going to generate more assists. He's going to have defensive rebounds that players didn't have. And that's all part of the wins produced metric. And if you didn't go through and take it all apart and put it back together again, you're not actually using it to predict. And then there is the other point that you made. If you're really interested in predicting next season's performance, you also have to take into account all the other things that cause performance to change. And if you didn't do that, you're really not doing prediction at all. And so one of the things that people have also done is they've done this where they tried to, and you guys, I know people at Boxscore Geeks do this, Arturo does this, where he tries to predict the next season. I don't know that I ever did that at the Wages of Wins Journal. I don't know that you can do that very easily because it is really difficult to predict minutes. And there's a real tendency as an analyst to fall in to imagine that the team is going to play the productive players the most
And
minutes.
by the way, I do on this show, I enjoy naming things a lot, Dave. And I actually called that, and I think I've told you this in passing, I call that the 2K problem. It's named after the NBA 2K series because you are thinking DeMarcus Cousins is amazing because if I had complete control of his brain like I do at NBA 2K, he would get 30 points on 60% true shooting and 20 rebounds and 5 blocks a game. And the same with teams. If I ran this team, Jeremy Evans, that's one of the favorites you like bring up. Jeremy Evans would get 36 minutes a night and we would win by, 5 points a night. Everybody, when we analyze teams, has the 2K problem where we have this immensely optimistic view of what's going to happen, and then the coach plays, Carmelo Anthony 48 minutes a night.
And I remember saying that Arturo did a forecast of the Utah Jazz where he had them winning a lot of games. And I said, Jeremy Evans is not playing that many minutes. And Arturo insisted he would. I said he's not going to. They don't play Jeremy Evans. I don't know why they don't play Jeremy Evans, but nobody plays Jeremy
Well,
Evans.
even I remember a funny follow-up example, a really short-term case. So you used to participate in the True Hoop Challenge, which was every year in the playoffs, they would ask a bunch of analysts to predict the outcome of each playoff, and it would each playoff round, it would reset each round. So the first round, you'd predict who would win in how many games. You get points for being correct. You get points for correct number of wins. And that would go on all the way to the finals. And there was a year where I believe you were in contention to win. And it is worth noting you did win it one year. And I think came runner up another year as well. But there was a year you were in contention to win it. This was when all of us were at the Wages of Wins together. And the Chicago Bulls were playing the Miami Heat in the playoffs. And the numbers said the Bulls are going to win. And the reason we thought this was because a couple players, I believe it was Carlos Boozer, Joakim Noah, and maybe one other guy, were playing really well. And if the Bulls played these players, they should have no problem beating the Heat. And of course, what happens, the Bulls, I think, went up 2-1, and then they stopped playing Noah and Boozer. I think it's Boozer. I could be wrong. But they stopped playing Noah. I know Noah was a huge... They stopped playing Noah. They started playing the backup player and then did worse and ended up losing. And that's a super short case example where you said, this guy has been playing great. He's played great this regular season, leading to your point margin. That leads me to believe you're a better team. He's been playing great in the playoffs, which leads me to believe you'll keep playing. And what did the coach do? The coach decided to change it up. That was you, an expert analysis. That's right. I use the term expert, Dave. Not being able to predict what a coach was going to do 3 games from now.
Exactly, and you can't predict that kind of stuff. And so, and that throws off all the analysis, because one of the things that you see when you look at the data, what the basic message of wins produced is, and I cover this in the articles I write for the popular media and my journal articles and the textbook. The basic message of wins produced is that wins are determined by very basic factors. It's determined by your ability to get possession of the ball, rebounds, turnovers, steals, your ability to turn possessions into points, which is shooting efficiency. And that it should be obvious to everybody. However, when you look at decision-making in the NBA, it is clear that decision-making is driven by how many points you score, time on the court. Now, that's it. And so players can manipulate perceptions by taking a lot of shots. And the players who take the most shots get to play the most minutes. And so what happens when you're doing analysis of wins produced and you're forecasting minutes is you're looking at the wins produced numbers and saying, well, clearly you would play this guy who's super productive over this other guy who just takes a lot of shots. No, they're not going to do it that way. And so Jeremy Evans is never going to find his way on the court because Jeremy Evans insists on not taking 50 shots again.
Well, it's funny. A great example of this is this last season, the Portland Trailblazers, who I wrote about, they lost 3 of their stars. They lost Wes Matthews, LaMarcus Aldridge, and Nicholas Batum. And everybody was, what are they going to do? And in a short period of time, they pick up all of these great wins produced players that we love. And lo and behold, they're not as good as they were the season before, but they're a playoff team. Because of a fluke injury in the playoffs to Chris Paul, they go on to the next round. And we're sitting here going, amazing. Look at what this team did. They didn't go for scores. They didn't go for these guys. They went for productive players and they put them on the court and it worked out great. And this offseason, what did they do? They gave all of their money to expensive scorers that took the most shots. So even a team that does what we think and does what we like, we watch how they spend their money, and it very immediately becomes clear they don't quite know what
they all make and there is no stat revolution in basketball. I don't see any real evidence that decision making has changed dramatically. Basketball is still rewarding the players who take the most shots. They've done that forever. I don't see them ever changing that. All the stats people are not going to change that. What I see the advanced stats people trying to do is land jobs with the NBA where they do
or ESPN at this point.
Or ESPN, and they get paid money to sound like they know what they're talking about, and they're largely ignored by everybody in the organization. Now, frankly, from a statistical point of view, if the model that you're selling to someone is RAPM, which doesn't explain anything, they probably should not be listening to you and have you tell them what to do. One of the classic examples of adjusted plus minus people not helping was when the Warriors played the Mavericks in the finals, and this was 10 years ago. And the Mavericks were told, don't play Eric Dampier.
It was even worse, Dave. You just said the finals because you're used to the Warriors being a winning team. This was a first round upset. It was a
first round upset. And the Mavericks chose not to play Eric Dampier because their adjusted plus minus person told them to. And he was one of their most productive players. And they decided to handicap themselves and not play them, and they got beat. And you're like, well, if you're not going to play your most productive players, you're right. You're not going to win very often. And that was an adjust plus minus person saying, well, I did this model and you don't do very well when Dampier's on the court. Well, yeah, your model has a lot of flaws in it, so it probably shouldn't be something you should be listening to.
Well, it's also, I mean, one of the issues with any plus minus statistic, and we've talked this forever. I think we're obviously winding down on the subject a little, Dave, so I'll try and wrap us up. But was just that you can't really tear apart players on the court together as well as people would like. Dampier as a starter, and this always bugged me. I'll give you an example. There was an article about Kevin Love in the finals, and to be fair, Kevin Love played horribly in the finals. I'm so glad he at least put up one game, because if he didn't, I was going to feel really bad. Kevin Love was playing horrible in the finals, and I saw some articles come out saying, here are Kevin Love's numbers this regular season when he was playing with the Cavs, and when he wasn't. Now, Kevin Love only missed 5 games. You're comparing a 77 game sample to a 5 game sample, and I believe of those 5 games, 3 of them were against like teams that missed the playoffs. So how do those samples make any sense? And when you look at a starter like Eric Dampier, or I think that's how you say it, if you look at his starters' minutes, well, he's going to play 36 minutes and not play 12. And if you're going to be convinced that the 36 minutes he plays and the 12 minutes he doesn't are equal samples, you're just fooling yourself. And we've seen this forever.
Yeah, and you know, and the same thing when they do this. They started doing when they do all the when the lineup analysis came out years ago. Remember when they started doing that? And so you'd have a sample of lineups, and then you go look at the original data and say, well, most lineups that teams put together, the sample is under 100 minutes for the season, which is less than 2 games.
Or about two. If it's about 100 minutes, that'd be 96 minutes in 2 games. Yeah, about 2 games.
So it's about 2 games. So that's in your sample. You're looking at a 2-game sample, and it's not 100 consecutive minutes. It's 100 minutes scattered throughout a whole season where this lineup happened to be together. And you're using that in your analysis. What the hell is that supposed to tell you? I don't know what the hell that means if you're looking at 100 minutes of a sample. That doesn't tell you anything. And so you say, I'm going to try to explain variation in this dependent variable, which is taken from a sample that's not significant enough. So there's no way in the world it's going to mean anything to you. And again, this is something that very basic textbook stuff. If your sample isn't sufficient, you can't say anything about it. And that's your answer. But if someone is paying you money, then I guess you just make up something. You know, I want to add one more thing about model analysis.
All right.
And I think this is something that people should understand about sort of the history of this stuff. When Wins Produce is introduced in the Wages of Wins in 2006, okay, at that point, the models that were out there, there was adjusted plus minus, which Wayne Winston put together. There was player efficiency rating. There was Dean Oliver's offensive rating, defensive rating, which turned into win shares. So that's the basic models that are out there. When it came to testing these models, nowhere, if you read John Hollinger's work, does he say that player efficiency rating explains wins. Nowhere in Dean Oliver's Basketball on Paper does he say offensive rating and defensive rating has this explanatory power of points scored and points given up, or points per possession and points surrendered per possession. They never discussed any of these things. So when I put forward Wins Produced, I said this model explains wins. It tells you how the players connect to wins. Suddenly, we now have to test everything. And the test that they sort of latched onto is, well, do you predict next season? Nobody ever suggested that was a test. And if you go back to any other metric in any other sport, they don't use that as a test. Nobody puts forward a quarterback measure and said, this explains next season. You're trying to explain this season. So they invented a test that doesn't exist anywhere else. And then, of course, again, they were adding back error terms to make the test look as good as they possibly could. This is all just an invented little way of doing things. And again, it's not the way anyone in a textbook.
And it was funny. This is what I got kind of sort of. I feel marginally bad, but not really. As I mentioned, the author of the nylon calculus paper blog post, came into the comment section and I threw him out. But, what was amusing to me is all of this came about where he linked a study by Neil Payne, who's now at 538. And at the end of the article, I said, you can't, the internet's not a classroom. You can't just assume that people writing blog posts are doing things correctly and that's what you should use it. And this person came in incredulous and said, I did learn in a classroom. I know what I'm doing. And so it's amusing to me that what you're saying about the kind of evolution of this is so many of these are based on flawed studies that made no sense from years ago, and we're still seeing it today. And like you're saying, that doesn't, there's no reason this should be the de facto way to do things other than some people on some forums years ago, which, as I mentioned, are linked in this very recent Nylon Calculus article, were used. And for whatever reason, the group of advanced analytics people are still using them.
Yeah, and unfortunately, if you think about the way in which decision making evolves and models evolve and learning evolves, you and I have had this conversation, and you've had this conversation with people many times over the years. So everything that we're saying here has already been said before. I would predict that nothing we're saying here is going to change anybody's mind or behavior. They will continue to do it exactly the same way they're doing it. It's a very closed community, and 10 years from now, we'll be sitting down having another Boxscore Geeks podcast saying exactly the same damn thing over another damn article that they did. There's not. I'm terrible. I'm very pessimistic that there's any kind of that's going to go on. They're not. The analysis that was done initially when they were criticizing Wins Produced was extremely flawed. I went through in a journal article with J.C. Bradbury explaining why it was flawed. I went through in Stumbling on Wins explaining why it was flawed. So I responded to what they said. I pointed out the problems. It had no impact on anybody.
It's worth noting, by the way, and that I keep cutting you off, Dave. Apologies. There was an article that you said Dan Rosenbaum. I always say Baum. I always do the long, but that he wrote this article that he was sure was going to get published, and it never did. And for a while, the only place it lived was on the Stumbling on Wins domain before you just let that lapse. That was the only place it lived because you hosted it so that you could reference it, which is like, that was you being fair. You were saying, I'm going to discuss this research. By the way, you can't find this research because no one will publish it. So I will at least give you a link. And then, of course, what happened with that, one of the analysts that we bring up a lot, Neil Payne, would regularly link that, not realizing that the only reason it was hosted on the web was because it was needed as a link to point out how bad it was by people who know what they're doing.
And it should have been the case when that article by Rosenbaum and Lewin appeared. It should have been the case the Abermetrics community, if they actually were what they purport they are, which is people who actually know how to do statistical analysis, they should have gone through and pointed out all the flaws, and every single section of that paper was wrong. And they should have noted all that. They didn't note any of that. Because they don't. I mean, this is, to me, the Abermetrics community, the way in which they evaluate research is, step one, are you in our group? And if the answer is yes, then you're okay.
And it's worth noting, unfortunately, you use the phrase Aber or ABPR. I always get it confused, as I mentioned, Dave. The problem now is, a bunch of these people work for ESPN now. A bunch of these people work for teams now. When you said you're pessimistic about the state of advanced stats going forward, I agree, because this niche, I don't want to say niche, this internet group that was at one point a bunch of analysts doing bad work, they are essentially at least the analytics side of the field now. And so, as you pointed out, this was already a field before there were analysts in analytics in basketball. Basketball was already an incredibly tight-knit, who do you know field. I mean, we noticed that with coaches, right? This coach gets fired. And another team hires him, and you go, why are you hiring this losing coach that got fired? And they go, well, we know him. So the problem now is you've said for years the ABPR community says this. The problem now is that's basically just the mainstream, I'll put in quote, advanced stats community of basketball.
Well, it is. I mean, they've been hired by coaches, and they've been hired by the ESPN. They're not mainstream in terms of academics. Nobody in academia that I know of takes any of this stuff seriously. One of the interesting things about the people who do academic research on sports and stats is most of them have never heard of any of these people. They don't know who the hell they are. I remember being at a meeting discussing something Rosenbaum had said, and people were like, who the hell's that? Has he published anything? And the answer was no. Well, then it doesn't count. Until you publish something, it doesn't mean anything to academics. And they've, of course, bypassed all that by just posting stuff online and declaring that it's right. And that's fine. So So that's sort of the state of where these things are. And again, we can come back to this again and again. The main point I'm trying to make simply is that the problems with this kind of analysis is really this is standard textbook stuff, very introductory stuff. If your purpose in writing this was to demonstrate how not to do something, you completely succeeded. I will be very happy to take this article and use it in my classes and point out the many mistakes that are being made here. And so as a learning exercise, this is great. Because one of the problems, of course, we have in teaching regression analysis is everything that's, the stuff that's done in journals tends to be right. So you can't point out how people do it wrong. Aerometric people have done a really great job of showing how to do things wrong. So it does a great job of allowing us to say, look, these are actual mistakes people make, and you can avoid them.
Let me ask you this, Dave. Do you count? I don't know. I'm a Midwesterner now. Does Michigan count as Midwest?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good. Because I was going to say that was the a very good example of Midwestern passive aggressiveness that I've ever seen. I actually I was at a relatives gathering today, and I actually referenced that to them, where they said an insult as a pseudo compliment, and I told them I said that's some good Midwestern passive aggressivism.
I grew up in the Midwest, so perhaps that's.
So I was going to say you are clearly an expert at that because that's
that would be accurate. I think that's right. Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest, so maybe I'm doing this right.
Are you an ooper or a troll, by the way?
What?
Yeah, have you heard this? Apparently, Michigan, you're called an ooper if you're from the Upper Peninsula, and you're called a troll if you're from the Lower Peninsula.
I'm going to point out, I left Detroit when I was 12 in 1981, so I don't claim anything.
All right, fair enough.
There is no chance that I would ever live in Michigan or the Midwest ever again.
Really? All right. Well.
Yeah, I don't know how to tell you this, Dre, but you do not have to live in Wisconsin. It is not required.
So interestingly, I'm going to point back to you again. You wrote an article a while back about why Utah is a fantastic NBA location for players because it's friendly and it's small and it's quiet and it doesn't have a lot of pollution. And obviously, you're saying like the exact opposite of places like Miami and New York, which of course NBA players like. Another piece that you could give to Utah is they have a great home court advantage because of altitude. So players look better when they play in Utah.
Salt Lake City's got a lot of pollution, but
yeah. But you said all of these reasons why I believe Cedar City was a good place to live and a good free.
Yeah, Cedar City is not. Yeah, you're right. Cedar City is phenomenal for that.
But what I was going to say is, for me, what I'm looking for in a place to live is, it's inexpensive, it's close to the water. I'm 5 to 10 minutes away from everything in my car. I got a Subaru, so the snow doesn't bother me. This is a perfect free agent location for me. I came from Colorado, and Colorado, Boulder, Denver show up all of the time in these lists of best places to live, best places for tech. I'm a tech guy. And, for me, what I basically was starting to get is this place is super crowded and has a bunch of traffic and everything's getting really expensive. So...
Yeah, I would, see, the advantage of Utah versus Colorado, and this is really, we've now gone way off topic, is Utah has all the scenery that Colorado has, but not the traffic.
And then I would assume not the cost. And it also has the skiing, right? Nobody ever brings that up, but Utah has great
skiing. Yeah, we have tremendous skiing in Utah. So, yeah. So it has all the same, it's the same Rocky Mountains. We're just on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, so.
Maybe I used to do polls more regularly before a site I liked called Polar Bee went down, but Twitter supports them now. So maybe the poll for this podcast will be: where would you rather live, Wisconsin, Utah, or Colorado? And we'll see what our listeners say.
I have a feeling Utah will lose because we just we're not well known, which is fine with me. I should point out, if you don't like Utah, I'm okay with that. We really don't need you moving here, so that's okay.
Yeah, I was telling my wife that where I live, Appleton, Wisconsin, is about 73,000 people, which is big enough for us to have all of the things you need. The Book of Mormon actually came through recently because we have a good performing arts center. We have, I think, 9 bowling alleys for whatever came up when I was reading an article on it. We have all the stuff I need. I don't need it any bigger. So I love Appleton, Wisconsin. There's no need for you to come here. We're at equilibrium. I was the last person that needed to show up here.
All right. I think we've exhausted our topic.
We have clearly exhausted the topic. Thank you. So, clearly you gave, essentially what we can call this is guest lecture on regression analysis from Dave Berri or something to that effect. I really appreciate it, Dave. We said this back and forth a lot. I don't think most people will get it, but at least for a couple that are interested in learning, they'll hear it.
I gave it a shot. once again, I've tried again to explain why this is wrong. I don't think I will be successful, but
Well, the good news is you actually get paid for a living to do this for people that give you money, which is why you can ignore all the people online who don't give you money and don't listen. You can
that's
do
true.
it to your students
That's
instead.
true. That's true. I am not paid to teach these people. That is true.
And I doubt many would. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dave. This has been the Box Score Geeks show guest episode. If you found us not through the website, we are at boxscoregeeks.com. You can find us on iTunes and Stitcher, the Box Score Geeks show. Subscribe, upvote, helps us out. This show we didn't announce, but we normally go live on twitch.tv/nerd numbers, typically Tuesday or Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Brian has informed me this episode does not count as this week's episode, so this should come out sometime Monday or Tuesday, so you should still expect an episode this week. And if you missed the live shows and want to catch the video, which we have, which has me this week putting my head in my hands as Dave does his Midwestern passive aggressiveness, you can catch that on YouTube channel Nerd Numbers. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.